spirit of translational invasion ecology, I'm going to share with you today some examples of work that I and my co-authors have done on invasive grasses in the conceptual framework of alternative stable states and with the goal of linking our work directly to management. Now, in the 30 to 40 years I've been studying invasive species, I've been aware of this tension between academia and management, in that academics tend to be rewarded and encouraged to create theory that is generalized and unifying across systems, whereas managers really just care about site and species-specific recommendations. Likewise, the success metrics are very different, where in academia, you're rewarded for the number of publications you have in high-impact journals, and in management, you tend to be rewarded for acres treated. So these sorts of differences create a situation where it's not obvious that management and academics would work together. And so I want to tell you today in some case studies of how we have, in fact, overcome these differences to work together. The two examples I'm going to share with you today are research that we have done on the Big Island of Hawaii on invasive perennial grasses. Invasive grasses are a management challenge throughout the world, and in many cases they fuel fires, which is the first example case study I'll present to you. But they can also simply be very aggressive competitors stalling succession in a post-disturbance landscape, and that will be the second example that I present to you. The framework that we have focused on in examining these species is that of alternative stable states, where you can imagine the desired ecosystem composition being this green wall, some sort of major disturbance or disruption pushing that ball into another state that is presumably undesirable from a management perspective. Now, trying to understand what keeps the ball in a particular state, or why systems are resilient and resistant to change, is a bunch of ecological questions, but they have direct management implications. And so what we have often asked are, what processes create the shape and the steepness of that cup? What is giving the system resistance and resilience? And what can be tweaked in management to move the ball to the desired cup and to keep it there after you get it? So one of the systems I've been studying, as I mentioned, is in Hawaii Volcanoes National Park. And here, since the early 1990s, I have collaborated with the Resources Management Division of the National Park Service. And over several different NSF grant iterations, I've had a whole variety of collaborators on that. And in this system, a native dry woodland is invaded by perennial C4 grasses that carry fire through the ecosystem, increasing the fire frequency and dramatically changing the system, because most of the natives are not fire tolerant. So you end up with an exotic dominated grassland that eventually becomes an exotic savanna with very low native resilience. And over the years of studying the system, we have studied the feedbacks between grasses and fire, the negative effects of fire on native woody plants, the interaction of native plants and exotic plants, and the effect of exotic species on nutrient cycling. Then most recently, Stephanie and I, about 10 years ago, got an NSF grant to look at the effects of drought and time on all of these interactions. And so we've generated quite a bit of research on this system, particularly on nutrient cycling and species interactions. And that research doesn't really help managers figure out how to deal with this grass-invaded system. What the managers care about are questions like, do the native species come back if they make the effort to suppress fire? And our long-term transects suggest the answer to this question is no. Now, if they don't come back, and if more fire is inevitable, what can be done to facilitate native biological diversity in this otherwise low diversity grass-dominated system? And this is a question that we could partner with management. So we asked the question, in sites that reburn, is there anything we can do to enhance resilience? And to address this, we built a partnership so we established a research collaboration with the Resources Management Division of the park to do a series of controlled burns, answering the academic question I'd been funded to do research on of how grass field fires affected nutrient cycling and loss over time, and the applied question of whether the post-burn window could be used to increase native diversity, particularly fire-tolerant natives, knowing that grasses and fire could be a long-term part of the system. So with these dual goals in mind, we identified a series of fire-tolerant native species, did some experimental seeding into controlled burns, and here's an example of one of these nodes 13 years after the controlled burn was done. And now post-fire seeding is a part of park management, and the Resources Management Division maintains a large cache of native seeds to seed in case of accidental fire in these ecosystems. So the success of this program was really due to early and consistent engagement between my group and park management. We have a long-term commitment to the area, and I think that is really important. We identified shared goals. We brought managers in on the research itself, and we had an honest discussion of what the best possible outcomes could be, since you really can't go back to the way the system was before grass invasions. And all groups brought resources to the table, which really helped get buy-in. The other example I want to tell you about is restoration of high elevation forests, also on Hawaii Island, where that little red square is. And at this point, this is with the National Fish and Wildlife Refuge. Stephanie had transitioned to working for USGS, and that's great because they are really a bridging agency designed to bring science and managers together. Now, in this system, high elevation forests are the key to endemic forest bird survival because climate change is pushing introduced mosquitoes that vector avian malaria up the mountains. So having high elevation forests is critical for endangered forest birds. However, much of the native Metrosideros forest on Hawaii Island was cleared, the high elevation forest was cleared for livestock grazing in the 1800s and converted to pasture through the introduction of European and African pasture grasses. So there's a few remnant trees scattered throughout, but mostly there were acres and acres of pasture when the Park Wildlife Service purchased the area in the 1970s or early 80s. Because there was no succession after the removal of cattle and the removal of pigs, they went into the area and planted hundreds of thousands, literally, of trees of the native species Acacia koa. These were planted strips from the park boundary that you can see here. From the intact forest boundary up to the upper edge of the wildlife refuge boundary. And it was believed that these strips of trees, those little lines you can see, would set succession in motion because they would shade out the grasses that were so competitive. They would attract birds, which would bring in seeds because the understory plants in this ecosystem, with the exception of ferns, the understory plants are entirely bird dispersed. And the tree cover would buffer winter temperatures, so we would see recruitment and succession. But in fact, that's not what you see. What exists on the landscape today, over tens of thousands of acres, is a sparse Acacia koa canopy, as you see here, and a very dense understory, primarily of kikuyu grass or Sancris clandestine. So this system is relatively unchanging over time. So we began to examine, Stephanie really set this project in motion, and then we got NSF funding for it. All of the feedbacks that might be important in maintaining an intact native forest versus those feedbacks that are present today that are maintaining this altered state with koa and exotic grass in the understory. And whether or not some of these feedbacks in the intact forest are missing, and that's why we're not seeing succession, or whether it's really all about the koa grass state. So again, we were able to establish right from the outset dual goals. We could ask the academic goal of what missing and ongoing feedbacks keep the understory from recruiting under koa, and what management action or actions could provide the most bang for your buck to accelerate forest recovery. So can these study of feedbacks lead to management action? So for example, one management action that has been occurring already is the planting of these woody understory plants. So we asked, can planting understory create a positive feedback where the more you plant, the more birds you pull in, the more birds you pull in, the more seed rain you get. And we measured seed rain under these planted understory plants and in places with no understory plants to see whether we were seeing a bird shrub feedback. And the quick answer to this is no, we are not seeing that yet. There is some seed rain and there is some visitation by these fruit dispersing or fruit eating birds, but not. We also did quite a bit of work on the koa grass feedback because all measures of nitrogen availability suggest that it's very high underneath koa, and that koa is basically creating a perfect condition for the growth of the nitrogen-loving grass, kikuyu, compared to, say, here, RO is rhamnonohea. So we wanted to know, can plantings actually suck down that nitrogen and shade out the grass and change this, what seems to be an ideal condition for grasses? So we looked at a gradient from no understory to as dense as we could find, and we found only a very slight reduction in grass biomass and no effect on N. And so that means that we need to plant understory in a different way. These understory plantings that are being done by volunteers are not being done at a high density. And we now believe that they need to be done at a much, much higher density. A series of management recommendations. And these recommendations are now being used by park management as the basis for their 5-year restoration planning and forest management plan. So rather than go through all these recommendations with you, I want to conclude, since I'm running out of time here, with a list of the things that I think have contributed to our ability to translate ecological knowledge into management actions in these ecosystems. The first is we have had local scale repeated contact with managers. I've worked in Hawaii now for almost 30 years. Stephanie's been there for 10 years. We interact with managers all the time, and I think that's really, really important to building trust. We have made management questions integral to our research. They're not just casually mentioned in the broader impacts. We've managed to bring our pet ecology questions together with management needs. We've created management briefings and fact sheets. And I think a really important point is that we have participated in local and regional meetings. Managers don't attend big international or national meetings. They go to local, regional meetings. And I think it's the kind of thing that we can actually start bridging knowledge to action.